Samson has been defined as a he-man with a she-weakness. Remember Samson from the Old Testament book of Judges, where we'll be in chapter 13 today? Samson had all the potential in the world, but twice he was brought down by a nagging woman. He was someone who could kill 1,000 men, but could not control his own temper. He was gifted by God, but all he could see was his own strength. The story of Samson has always intrigued me because everything we read about Samson is negative. It seems everything we see is him doing something wrong, and yet he's the protagonist in the story. He's the hero, the good guy. He's even found in the Hebrews chapter 11 Hall of Faith, although he appears to be the villain when we read about his life. Even more intriguing to me is the fact that God seems to be the one pulling the strings in Samson's life. Whenever we read about Samson doing something that seems horrible, like going and killing 30 people, as we're going to see in a minute, it says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and then he did those things. So there's some troubling verses in the story of Samson's life. It seems that God is the one making him do these sinful or evil things. And there's also the enigma of Samson's strength. He has this seemingly superhuman strength, right? And those of you that know the story know that the power, the strength, was found in his hair. As long as he did not cut his hair, he would have this strength. But often when we think about Samson, we might picture him like some Mr. Universe type guy, like some bodybuilder. Think Arnold Schwarzenegger in the 1990s. Remember him? And we might picture Samson as somebody that looks like that, bulging biceps, somebody that's ripped with these huge muscles. I remember as a kid seeing little cartoon Bible stories or those flannel graphs or however we learned Bible stories. And whenever there was Samson, this just big, strong, hulking guy that looked like a heavyweight champion or something. But if Samson really had these gigantic muscles, why do you think people were so desperate to know what the secret of his strength was? Remember when Delilah was saying, Samson, won't you tell me what makes you so strong? Samson didn't just say, it's these right here, baby. What do you think? I mean, if he was this guy with huge muscles, then there wouldn't be such a curiosity about what makes him so strong. But yet everybody wanted to know, what is the secret of Samson's strength? So I think part of what is so intriguing about Samson is that he looked like an average Joe. Or to quote one pastor several years ago, he said, if we were casting the role of Samson today, we might do better to pick Barney Fife than Arnold Schwarzenegger. You remember Don Knotts, remember Barney Fife? We would not think of someone like that as Samson, but I think that's part of the mystery of Samson, that he didn't look like he could do the things that he did, but he had that strength because the Lord had given it to him. I invite you to Judges chapter 13 if you're there today. We are going to see this morning through the course of the message, and you might say, I know all about Samson's life, but we're going to divide this into two parts. But today I want us to focus on this, that Samson substituted peace and joy for anger and depression. Can I say that again? We're going to see this morning that Samson substituted peace and joy for anger and depression. God used Samson in spite of Samson. Samson could have been a willing vessel that said, God, my life is yours, use me however you see fit, but he didn't do that. Samson, time after time, tried to pull control back from himself, and rather than doing what God said, Samson wanted to be in charge of his own life. Now, God still used Samson. See, God's plans will not be thwarted even by our own shortcomings. God is sovereign and will do what he wants to do. He can do it through us. He can do it the easy way or the hard way. And Samson, because he was so stubborn, he forfeited and substituted the peace and joy he could have gotten from being in the center of God's will. And instead he chose anger and depression for himself, loneliness, because he just would not do things God's way. If we're going to look at his story tonight, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning. I said tonight. I don't know why I said tonight. This morning, we've got to go back to the beginning and see even the birth of Samson when it was foretold. And there were some special rules that Samson was going to have to live by. Let's see his rules in chapter 13, beginning in verse 2. It says, there was a certain man of Zorah of the tribe of the Danites whose name was Manoah. And his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, behold, you are barren and have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Therefore, be careful and drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. On Sunday nights, we've been going through the book of Judges. And Sunday mornings, we've been in 2 Corinthians. Today and next week, we're kind of flip-flopping the order. And so we will be in Judges for this morning and next week. But for those of you that might not be familiar with the book of Judges, maybe you have not been with us on Sunday nights, there is this pattern we see in the book of Judges where Israel was supposed to serve God, and as long as they did, everything was okay. But they would turn from God, they would begin to serve other gods, the gods of the nations around them. And then the Lord would allow some other nation to rise up and oppress Israel, to tax them, to enslave them, to do different things, to the point where they would cry out to God, please save us, God. Send us someone who will rescue us or deliver us. And God would do that. He would raise up a judge, a deliverer. People like Gideon or people like Deborah and Barak, some of the people that we've been looking at. And then they would rise up and the Lord would use them to obliterate their enemies and Israel would once again be at peace. But this breaks the pattern in the life of Samson. We don't see what we see throughout the rest of the book of Judges here. Rather than the nation rising up and saying, God, we've had enough, we want you to save us, they had become complacent. The first verse said that the Philistines had been ruling over Israel for 40 years. For 40 long years, the Israelites were okay with the Philistines oppressing them. We don't see any repentance. We don't see any prayer and fasting. We don't see anybody crying out saying, Lord, please save us. And so the Lord appoints Samson kind of in spite of Israel. But Samson doesn't get an army together and lead them in a victorious battle like all of the other judges had done before him. Samson will begin to save Israel from the Philistines, but it would not happen in his lifetime. Part of that is because of the choices that Samson made. It would not be years later until the time of King David that the Philistines would be defeated once and for all. But Samson would begin to get the ball rolling. Israel had done this so many times that God was getting fed up with what they were doing. And so God is going to raise up Samson kind of in spite of Israel and their sin. And so we see this lady, her name is not given to us, but she had no child. The angel of the Lord appears to her, and I believe that is Jesus himself. And he lets her know that you're going to have a child, but there's some special rules. First of all, you, as the mother, you should not drink any strong drink, which you shouldn't when you're pregnant, right? But he also says, eat no unclean thing. That's kind of a strange thing to say because everyone in Israel was supposed to abstain from eating anything that was unclean. This was given in the law. You could eat fish, but you can't eat pork. I mean, they had things that they could eat, things that were off limits. Nobody in Israel should have eaten any unclean thing. The very fact that God has to say this to her just lets us know that Israel was living in a condition where they did not care about the things of God. She should not have had to have been told, don't eat any unclean thing. That it should be very obvious to her, but it just lets us know that the nation was in deep rebellion. So she was not to eat anything unclean, but then she's told that her son is going to have some special rules for himself. No razor shall ever touch his head. As I look around lately, it seems like we've got a lot of people that have taken a similar Nazirite vow. Guys' hair is getting much longer these days. Have you noticed that? These mullets and stuff, guys' hair like halfway down their back. I thought about growing out a mullet. I was trying to do that for a little while, but if you were wondering last week, my hair just looked awful, but I finally gave in and got a haircut. I can't pull it off, not for me. But Samson didn't have a choice in the matter. Samson was told before he was born, his mother was told, he will never have a haircut. He will never have a razor touch his head. Why? Because he will be a Nazirite from the womb, from before he was born. What is a Nazirite? A Nazirite vow was a voluntary thing that a person could do under the old covenant law. For a certain amount of time, however long that person wanted to do it, a month, a couple of months, whatever, they would say, during this time I might fast, I might give up something, but I'm going to show my dedication to God while I pray about a certain thing. And during that time, they would not get a haircut. But at the conclusion of the vow, they would get a haircut, and then they would take some money into the treasury. And so the haircut showed that the vow was over. Samson was never to have a haircut because he was never supposed to end his vow. He's the only person in Scripture that took a Nazirite vow because it was chosen for him. It was always supposed to be voluntary. He's also the only person that began a vow from before birth, and he's the only person that was supposed to continue the vow for the entirety of his life. And this lets us know that there was supposed to be something special about Samson. If we were to continue reading, we will read that he was never supposed to drink from the fruit of the vine, not even to touch grapes, and he was not supposed to touch anything dead. That might not be that big of a rule for us. And most of us don't go around touching anything dead on a daily basis. But their culture was a lot different than ours. We have undertakers. They took care of all that stuff themselves. They would prepare a body for a burial and handle all of that. On the farm, in a farm culture, they might have cattle that would die and they would have to dispose of that. We go to the grocery store and we get our meat pre-packaged, but they wouldn't do that. They would cut it up. They would be their own butcher. They would routinely interact with things that had died. And Samson was told, his mother was told he should never touch anything that is dead. She tells her husband, he's a little skeptical, and then the angel of the Lord returns and then speaks to him, and he finally gets on board. In verse 24 of chapter 13, we see that this prophecy comes to pass, and the child is given a name. Verse 24 says, "The woman bare a son and called his name Samson. And the young man grew, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him." So God's Holy Spirit is working in his heart. Samson is going to do some incredible things, but he does not do it apart from God. The name Samson was not picked out for him. It seems like the parents got to choose this name. It's difficult to translate from the Hebrew, but it sounds like it means small son, or S-U-N, small son. And it was probably an affectionate nickname, like we might say Sonny Boy. And the idea is probably that Samson was a light in their dark world. After years of barrenness and not having children, at last they were given a son who was a shining light in the darkness. In Israel, that was in spiritual darkness, and Samson would hopefully be a light that would begin to turn the tide for them. So now Samson grows up, and we fast forward a little bit. We see the rules that he was supposed to live by, but we will now begin seeing him break those rules as we look at his relationship. Samson meets a girl, and then he begins to throw his Nazirite vow out the window. We skip ahead to chapter 14, if you will, and we'll read the first 10 verses. It says, "Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and he told his father and mother, 'I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife.' But his father and mother said to him, 'Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all of our people that you must go and take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?' But Samson said to his father, 'Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes.' His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, that the Lord was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. And at that time the Philistines ruled over Israel. Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah, and behold, a young lion came toward him roaring. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and he talked with the woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes. And after some days he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. And he scraped it out into his hand, and he went on, eating as he went. And he came to his father and mother and gave some to them, and they ate. But he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of the lion. His father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. We see that Samson goes into a Philistine city. Why would he leave his home and go into a Philistine city to meet this woman? Evidently, Samson knew that this was the place if you want to go and have a good time. The kind of good time that people that were supposed to serve the Lord should not be having. This city in Timnah was probably like the red light district, the place that you would go if you want to get into a little bit of trouble. And Samson had to go far from home in order to make this happen, to get away from his own people, his own family. And when he's there, he meets this woman who he says is right in his own eyes. Don't we see that phrase throughout the book of Judges? There was no king in Israel, and everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. We see that over and over in the book, and now Samson is using that same language of himself. I want her to be my wife because this is what I want to do. But then verse 4 is kind of tricky. They did not know that it was the Lord that put this on Samson's heart. The Lord was seeking an opportunity to punish the Philistines. So we have to ask the question, did God make Samson sin? Hold that thought. I don't want to correct a child. Did God make Samson sin? The answer is actually no. God did not make Samson sin. Now look, in the New Testament, we read that God does not tempt anyone with evil, and God does not cause us to sin. But here in the Old Testament, it seems like God is like a puppet master, maybe pulling the strings and making Samson do something that is wrong. But I do not believe that God would ever lead us to sin. Samson is responsible for the choices that he makes. But Romans 8:28 teaches us that God works all things together. Now, when we finish that verse, we say he works all things together for good to those that love God and are called according to his purpose. Yes, but don't miss the fact that God is able to work all things together so that when we make mistakes, God can work our mistakes for a part of his better plan. When we do things wrong, God is big enough that he can work through us and still take the mistakes that we make. And God is able to work all things together to accomplish his own plan. Does that mean that God makes us sin? Absolutely not. Does that mean that God was tempting Samson? No, but God knew Samson better than Samson knew himself. And when Samson was no doubt bent on going into this city to have himself a good time, the Lord said, I will use his own fallenness, I will use his weaknesses, and I will use those to accomplish my better plan. In a perfect world, Samson could have been raised up as a powerful deliverer like Gideon and led Israel in victory against the Philistines. But Samson would not do that, and so the Lord nudged him and the Israelites in general to push them closer to a conflict with the Philistines. Or to quote Gary Phillips, he said, this does not mean that God made Samson's evil choices for him. Rather, God was using the evil choices of men who God knew exhaustively and infinitely in order to bring about his plan for the universe. God knew Samson had a weakness for women, and the Lord used that to help bring about his plan. So while he's going down to Timnah, there's a roaring lion, and barehanded Samson rips this lion apart. And I love the note of clarification here. Just as one rips apart a young goat. So if you're wondering how he did it, just think, well, how would I rip apart a young goat? Oh, okay, like that. That must be how he did it, right? I always thought that was one of the strangest phrases in all of Scripture. Now, he ripped apart a lion just as one rips apart a goat. But in their culture, that would have been something a little more common than ripping apart a lion with his bare hands. But in other words, it's to say, it was no problem for Samson to do that. He did not struggle. He was able to, I picture Hulk Hogan, how he used to rip apart that shirt. Remember how he would do that? And I picture Samson just grabbing this lion, no problem, and just tearing this thing apart with his bare hands. And he continues on what he's doing. On the way back, it says he turned aside to see the carcass. In Hebrew, that phrase means that he was intentionally looking for it. He didn't stumble upon it and said, oh yeah, I forgot about that. But while he's walking, he's thinking, that lion carcass ought to be around here somewhere. It's like he wants to see what he had done. Like a trophy of his own exploits, he wants to see this lion, and he's not supposed to touch anything dead. And when he finds what he's looking for, he notices the honey that's inside it. Honey's delicious, and in their culture, it was a delicacy. It was the sweetest substance that they could find in their culture. And so finding that honey, he gets down and he scrapes it out of the lion, completely coming into contact with its dead body as he's not supposed to do. And he goes home eating this honey all the way, and rather than being ashamed of himself, he walks right in the door and sees his mom and dad and says, got a present for you guys. And he gives them the honey, and they begin to eat it. If they knew that he had scraped that out of the carcass of a lion, I don't think they would have eaten the honey. Number one, because that's disgusting. But number two, because they knew that he had violated his vow by doing that. And they wouldn't just be enjoying themselves. Oh, delicious honey, thank you, Samson. They would have been saying, Samson, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Why would you do something like this? But he's not ashamed of himself. In fact, he takes this very event and he works it into a riddle. We've seen his rules, we've seen his relationship, and now I want to see the riddle that he's going to pose. He told his father, I want you to arrange the marriage for me for this woman, and his father does that, and so now it's time for that 7-day wedding feast where they would celebrate. And Samson just can't help himself. We pick up in verse 11. It says, as soon as the people saw him, the Philistines, they saw Samson. They brought 30 companions to be with him. That word companion means guardian. They didn't trust him. They surrounded him with 30 people to keep an eye on him at all times. So verse 12 says, Samson said to them, "Let me now put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within the 7 days of the feast and find out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes." And they said to him, "Put your riddle to us that we may hear it." So here's his riddle in verse 14. He said to them, "Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. And in 3 days, they could not solve his riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet." What's he talking about here? It's the lion and the honey, right? Out of the eater, that's the lion, king of the jungle. They eat all kinds of things. Out of the eater came honey, something to eat. Out of the strong, that lion, came something sweet, which is honey. Man, rather than being ashamed of himself, he's proud of himself. He uses this to put a riddle to these people that he knows not in a million years could they ever figure this out on their own, because how could they have known that he found honey in the carcass of a lion? This is not a riddle that they could have cracked. And so he knows that he's going to win this, and he sets the stakes very high. He is going to enlarge his wardrobe here by 30 changes of clothing, because they'll never figure this out. And they can't. They think about it for 3 days, racking their brain, and they can't figure out the answer to his riddle. In fact, Samson was really making a good play on words here, because at this wedding feast, these people would eat and eat and eat for 7 days. They would gorge themselves at this all-you-can-eat buffet, to the point where it was very common in their culture at these weddings that guys would eat until they actually threw up because they were so full. And then they would say, "Well, now I made more room that I can eat again." And so at these wedding feasts, they had this joke where they would say, "Out of the eater came something to eat." And Samson takes that kind of gross idea and he weaves it into his riddle. And he knows that they will never figure it out. The stakes aren't really all that high, though, for each individual person. These 30 people, if they can't solve the riddle, what's one change of clothing for them? But they can't stand it. And so in verse 15, they go to Samson's wife here. On the 4th day, they said to his wife, "Entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is. Get this, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us?" Whoa! They're threatening to kill this girl if she doesn't tell them the answer to the riddle. "We will burn you and your whole family inside your father's house." Calm down, guys, right? It's just a change of clothes. But this shows us it's more. They're not going to be impoverished, but this is just their own ego getting in the way. They cannot let Samson get the better of them, and so they threaten physical harm to this girl. She does not tell them the answer. So in verse 16, she goes to Samson, and she begins to cry. His wife wept over him, and she said, "You only hate me. You do not love me. You have put a riddle to my people, and you have not told me what it is." I love his answer here. He says to her, "Behold, I have not told my father nor my mother, and shall I tell you?" Not the right thing to say on your wedding day, guys. In other words, he's saying, look, I haven't told my own parents. You think I'm going to tell you? Yeah, I love them far more than I love you. I mean, that's basically what he's saying. She goes, "You hate me." He goes, "Well, I love my parents, and I haven't told them, so don't get too worked up about it." Not the right thing to say. That's not going to smooth things over with her. And so she continues to nag him. It says in the next verse that over the next few days, she presses him hard. She's relentless. She keeps the act up. She's crying. She's shedding tears. "Oh, if you loved me, you would tell me. If you loved me, you would tell me the answer." And when he cannot take it anymore, on the last day of the feast, he breaks. And he tells her the answer. We see it in verse 17. Let's go to verse 18. It says, "The men of the city said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down," right before it was over, they said to him, "What is sweeter than honey? And what is stronger than a lion?" And he said to them, again, not something to say on your wedding day, fellas, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." I don't claim to be a romantic. I'm no Bill Shakespeare, but guys, They don't like being called heifers. Can I just tell you that for free? All right, just do with that what you will. If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. Now, aside from calling his wife a female cow, what he was saying to them is, you did something you were not supposed to do. You don't plow with a heifer. You use a donkey, you use oxen, but you do not use heifers to plow a field. So what he's saying is, you cheated. You did something off limits. You broke the rules when you plowed with my heifer. You would not have solved it otherwise. And in Samson's mind, because they broke the rules, then he would be justified in what he does next. He owes a debt, 30 changes of clothing that he now has to pay up. No problem. He knows how to take care of it. Verse 19, the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him, and he went out to Ashkelon, that's one of the Philistine cities, and he struck down 30 men of the town and took their spoil, and he gave their garments to those who had told the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. Samson needed 30 changes of clothing, so he goes out and kills 30 Philistines, disrobes them, and carries their clothing back to these 30 guys. I mean, I can imagine him saying, yeah, sorry, there might be a little blood on those guys. Don't worry about that. But a deal's a deal. We're square. You know, I owed you 30 changes of clothing. There you go. But again, we see the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him when he did this. So you might say, Samson's wrong for what he did here. Well, the Spirit of the Lord came on him and caused him, gave him the strength to do what he did. This is very difficult for us once again. We need to understand that God was trying to use Israel as his hand of judgment against the Philistines, who were unspeakably wicked. They were bloodthirsty. They were violent. They practiced human sacrifice. They did all kinds of terrible things. And God was trying to get Israel to be his hand of judgment against them, just as he had used Joshua to drive out the inhabitants all those years ago. And Israel's not doing it, and Samson's not doing it. And so the Lord uses Samson's anger and the fact that these guys cheated, and he uses that to get Samson to do something that was going to begin to drive a wedge between the Philistines and the Israelites. Israel had gotten way too comfortable with the Philistines oppressing them. And by God using Samson to do this, and I imagine those 30 people were probably the worst of the worst, people that on God's calendar were due up for some divine judgment, and God used Samson to execute that judgment. But God was also now going to turn the Philistines against Israel, which would in turn turn Israel against the Philistines. God was trying to get them to this place where he wanted them to be. But now in Samson's anger, after he pays off his debt, rather than going to his wife, he goes to his parents' house. He goes there to cool off. And evidently several months passes. And when Samson finally calms back down, he says, well, I'm going to go collect my wife now. And when he goes to get her, chapter 15, the next verse tells us that he brought a young goat with him. If you ever call your wife a heifer, guys, you might want to send flowers. Samson chose to send a young goat. So he goes up to his wife and he brings a goat with him, and then he says, hey, where's my wife? And his father-in-law says, oh, we didn't think you were coming back. He says, I gave her to your best man. She's married now, but he says, hey, I've got another daughter. I'd be more than happy to allow you to marry this daughter. And Samson doesn't like the terms of this deal. So rather than marrying that daughter, Samson goes back into the town of the Philistines, and he does what any normal person would do in that situation. He catches 300 foxes, and he ties their tails together and sets them on fire, right? Perfectly rational thing to do. No, Samson gets 300 foxes, pairs them off in twos, ties their tails together, and turns them into torches. The text tells us it was the harvest season. And not only did they have their food that was growing, but they had what they had already gathered and had stacked up, and they were ready to eat this and sell this and live off of this for the next year. And Samson makes sure that they don't. By using these foxes as torches, with their tails tied together, they would run in a zigzag pattern, and they set everything on fire. And he completely destroyed their crop, which would crash their economy overnight. And so Samson now, in his anger, is now trying to get back at the Philistines. In his mind, he's probably thinking, they're getting what they deserved because of what they've done for me. But here's what we know about Samson. And we're going to pause in the text here, and we'll pick up next week in chapter 15. But we see that Samson is childish. He's narcissistic. He has a vengeful spirit. He's the type of guy that can hold a grudge and make you pay for it. Samson could have been somebody that had a good life. He could have been somebody that had joy and peace and loved life. But everything we read about Samson, we see he's angry, we see he's bitter, we see he's jealous, we see that his feelings are hurt, and I believe that he even acted out of loneliness and depression, and we'll see that even more next week. Samson, as I said at the beginning, he substituted joy and peace for anger and depression. You and I make those same choices when we choose to live outside of God's will for us. Yes, the Lord was using Samson to accomplish his will, but he was doing it the hard way when he could have done it the easy way. We could say it like this, that God could work with Samson, or God could work in spite of Samson, and God was choosing the latter. God's saying, I'm going to judge the Philistines through you, Samson. I can make you a mighty general like Gideon, or I can make you a complete failure through your choices, and I can still work through a failure like you. And I believe that God looks at us and says the same thing, Christian, church. God says, I can work with you to carry out the Great Commission, or I can work in spite of you if you will not allow me to use you. God could bless this church and say, we're going to be a church that reaches our community. Or God can say, if you're not going to do it my way, I'm still going to be praised, I'm still going to get glory, but we might have to do it the hard way. There might have to be judgment and church discipline. There might have to be joy, there might have to be anger and frustration where there could be joy and peace. God wants to work with us and do it the easy way. But the one thing God will not do is choose for us. Do you understand that? The one thing God will not do is choose for us. In our free will, God says, I can do it like this, or I can do it like that. And the choice is yours. As Moses stood up before the Israelites, he said, I've set before you this day life and blessings, or death and curses. And you must choose life for yourself. And the Israelites continually chose the curses. I believe today, right before us, it's the same thing. We have a choice. Life and blessing, death and curses. Which will we choose? If you have been saved, we can choose joy and peace in our life. We can choose to walk with God and experience that abundant life where even if things aren't going our way, we still have joy. The things we can't control, we don't try to control, but we can still smile and love life because we're walking with God in the center of His will. And God uses us, and we share our faith, and we give our money, and we use our spiritual gifts, and we worship and serve together, and God does great things through us. Or we can choose to live life our way and say, nobody tells me what to do. I'd rather do it like this. And Jesus said that if we don't praise His name, He says that He will make the rocks and stones begin to cry out and testify. So don't think for a second that God needs us. He can make the rocks cause a revival. But God would rather work through us, and I would rather God work through me. I don't want Him to have to turn to the rocks to begin to tell people who He is. I'd rather serve God. I'd rather live life the way He wants me to live it. I'd rather us be the church He wants us to be. If you've been saved, are you a willing vessel that God can use? Are you working with God, or is He going to use you in spite of yourself? God's will not be thwarted by our sin, but I would rather us serve God and allow Him to use us to the best of our ability. And if you've never been saved, you're not going to have that joy and peace. You're wandering like Samson. You might say, no, I've got it all together. No, deep down, you know that something's missing. You know that you're not right with the God that made you. I'm so proud of Macy and her salvation and her baptism this morning. She came to a place where she realized that she was made by God to be in a relationship with God. And she chose that for herself. Maybe there's someone today that you need to choose God for yourself. I'm tired of doing it my way, living life apart from God, trying to fill that God-shaped void. If you would give your life to Jesus today, you would see exactly how you fit into His plan. God's will is going to be done, so we better get on board. He can use me in spite of me, but I would rather serve the Lord. I want to live a life of joy and one that's filled with peace that only comes when we obey, and Jesus is our King. God will do many things in spite of us, but He will not choose for us. The choice is yours. What will you choose? Will you stand with me, please, this morning? As Miss Nancy's at the piano, we have an opportunity to respond. Maybe the Lord has laid something on your heart and challenged you. Thank you once again for tuning in to our live broadcast here at Putman Baptist Church. As always, we appreciate you being a part of our service from wherever you choose to watch. But we want to let you know that if you should ever have any questions about what you've heard in the morning's message, or questions about how to be saved, to know whether or not you're going to go to heaven one day, or you'd like prayer or anything else, we would love to hear from you. Just because you're not here in the building doesn't mean that you're not still part of this fellowship. So please, feel free to give us a call. You can reach me on my cell phone at 426-3706, or you can call the church office, or send us a message right here on the church Facebook page, and somebody will get in touch with you very soon. Thank you again. God bless you, and hope you have a great day.